My name's Frances Thacher, and I'm a nurse midwife since 1980, and I've been practicing in New York exclusively through my career, and I've been a hospital-based midwife throughout the 30-odd years of practice. I'm a transplant from Ohio, but I lived in New York all my life. I worked in New York City, but live outside the city. I work for the foundation, work volunteer board work, but not hospital-wise. I haven't worked since 2006, where I left my job because I had a diagnosis of multiple sclerosis. So I couldn't really be dependent on, I thought. So I left and worked for a while, working as a midwife in a prison system, taking care of inmates, where I would do the prenatal work for the inmates in a tertiary care setting prison in New York. That was very interesting because women who are incarcerated, they get a pregnancy test, and where they're sent to a prison that has a medical facility and for the duration of the pregnancy. And I would pick them up as in the prenatal group and take care of them throughout the pregnancy. Well, because first of all, someone listens to them for the first time. They've been bounced around a system where people didn't care, and they're always the underserved and the forgotten. And it's nice to have someone dote on them and give them the kind of care that you would want to have for yourself, and you could finally give it to these inmates. You don't think of them as inmates, but as patients. Every woman deserves the time-honored care that midwives give their patients, and prison is no exception. No, not fully, because I couldn't deliver them. I had to see them prenatally. So there was the whole business of the delivery, and when they were sent to the hospitals where they would eventually deliver, they were handcuffed to a gurney, and they had to have a guard in the room, and it was very intrusive birth, and not at all that one-on-one that you've given them prenatally. And so I felt terribly guilty about letting them down, but the red tape to deliver them was so enormous that I couldn't do it. Oh yes, they were empowered for the first time. I mean, these are women that never had been in a group before, hardly been in school, never given a real chance to be heard, and all of a sudden they were in a small group of women, and that whole business of being sisters together and growing towards a common goal of being a parent was something that they all could take at the same time. And for the first time, many of them, they responded like the eternal plant to water, and they just ate it up and grew and grew. And then when they had the babies, the empowerment that they felt during the prenatal course just surfaces, and they carries them through. And then you pick them up afterwards again. They come back into the group. So you get to share a little bit, and many of them, the birth was only one stop on the big road, and they were forgiving of not being there. So it worked out nicely. Sad to lump them all together, but all of them were just not individuals. The system had downgraded them into a number, and just giving them the chance to write a story about what this baby meant to them. And some women had 6 babies at home, and they were incarcerated and separated from them. And you'd ask them to write a letter to the baby that they were having at that moment, and they would write letters of enormous importance placed on the baby to have how it was going to change their lives subsequent to the birth, how it was going to erase some of the hardships that they felt that they had endured. just the joy of that baby, and that baby was special to other babies that they had and maybe thrown away, literally, you know. So many of the women said, my aunt took care of this one and that one, and my grandmother and this one, that one. I never got up at night, because the prison system has a way to allow the mothers and babies to room together for 18 months, so the babies weren't sent away. It was an option to keep the baby. Some of the babies were sent away, but many women got to keep their baby. They spent more time in prison with the babies than they would have at home, had Auntie come in and taken care of the baby. It is a strange irony. But those babies that were nurtured with the mothers in prison were the most socially acclimated babies because they had their mothers. Didn't matter that the prison walls were there. You know, the babies were happy, they had their mother, they were breastfed, they were in a confines of other women with other babies, and it was one big daycare, nice situation. You know, it's funny that my roots in midwifery came from, I had the chance when I was in my 20s to go to Africa to live with the pygmies. And I was with an anthropologist called Colin Turnbull, who wrote The Forest People, the Mabuti Pygmies. And he offered me the chance to go to Africa to watch the Mabuti boy circumcision ritual, which was historically 8 to 12-year-olds going through circumcision in the jungle. And I went for the 3-month circumcision ritual, and because I was female, I wasn't allowed to see the actual circumcision ritual. It was very secretly guarded as a male-only, men-only ritual. I hung out with the women, and the women were in various stages of pregnancies, like all women, every place. And I would hang out with them, and I got to see a couple of births while I was there, and the births were so phenomenal. They were, they'd go to a special place in the jungle that they had planned under a special palm tree, and the mother, the grandmother, the sister, the friend, whoever the woman wanted to be there, but typically the female line. And she would labor under the tree, and she would lie down, and she would walk, and she would squat, and she would walk some more, and I thought this was grand. I came from New York, where, you know, my idea of obstetricians were sterile hospital rooms, and so I was in the situation where I saw women naturally embracing pregnancy and labor, and they labor under this tree, and then when they birth, they squatted, and out came the baby, and the baby was presented to the forest as the all-consuming sort of religious deity of the forest, mother-father figure. And the fathers had made a bark cloth from the palm tree, and they'd made all their squiggles and lines and pictorial essay of what the baby meant to them in their culture. And then they'd wrap the newborn in this bark cloth. It was the consistency of paper towel, but pounded thin from bark. And the baby was wrapped up and presented, as I said, to the forest, and then the mother and grandmother and sisters and would all go back to the hut and celebrate the birth of the baby. And I saw this, and I immediately thought, you know, how can I do this in New York? You know, how can I do this? And I thought, if I go home, and I was in college at the time, I said, if I go home, go to medical school, I'm going to be an obstetrician, and I don't think they did this, you know, I said. And I came back to New York, and I finished college, and I went to find Ruth Lubick, who was an anthropologist and a midwife, but I didn't know anything about midwifery, and she sat me down and she said, Frances, with your background in anthropology, because I got a BA in medical anthropology, and she said, you really should look into this collection of women called midwives. It's not very well known. There's about 200 and something members. This was in 1974. And I said, midwives, I said, how do I do it? And she said, well, you have to go to nursing school, and you have to work, and you have to go to get a master's degree. And I said, Ruth, that's 6 years. I could be a resident, a doctor by then. And she said, I know, but the good news is that you're not going to be a doctor. And I said, okay. And so I went to Columbia and got my nursing degree again. I got my working for a couple of years, and then I went and got my master's. I took the vision of Africa with me to all my subsequent births. I mean, I may have practiced in a hospital in New York, but for each one, it was like I was in the village. Just let my women relax and do what they do naturally, and celebrated every birth. And I took everything I did in Africa, almost literally, brought it back to New York. It was truly remarkable. And I started a program in New York City. This was in the 90s, where it wasn't common yet, but I wanted to have a one-stop shop type of operation, where the hospital I worked at complained that literally every Friday afternoon, the plane from Puerto Rico landed, and out came 300 pregnant women, and the next stop would be the hospital, where they were in labor, and they'd come and give birth and have natural Americanized babies. And all these births were on the record as unregistered, so you didn't have the records, and which was a terrible position to take care of these patients with scars everywhere, and you couldn't talk to them, and they couldn't tell you what happened to them. They had no idea what their medical record was. And I thought, how can I get rid of the unregistered rate? So I devised a program where I had outside funding, and I advertised right from the airports. You could come to the clinic and get registered for Medicaid, see a social service volunteer, get your blood done, get your first prenatal visit done, and then be registered. And I had a group of midwives, and we made it a party. We had a celebration every Wednesday night. We'd bring food, and we'd get together, and we'd go over the cases. And this clinic would start at 5, and we'd finish at midnight. We'd had such a good time because we had all the patients, and we had T-shirts and memorabilia for them, and the patients just ate it up, and they loved it, and they came from all over. And one of the problems when you run a clinic is that patients drop out and you lose them. Well, we had no such problems with the retention. The patients died to come to see us. They'd line up at 3 o'clock to come to be seen at 5 o'clock. And we had the midwives take care of it, and it was called SLRP, St. Luke's Roosevelt Early Registration Program. And we had them all dressed in hats and T-shirts, and they'd deliver, and we'd bring them back, and we'd have parties, and we'd have daycare groups, and it spun off into all sorts of social services from that group. But that was because of my Africa experience. I just took what I learned from my anthropology and applied it to good old New York and its problems. And had nothing but success with it. Nothing but success. And this stood me in good standing throughout my practice, My highlight really was the clinic in St. Luke's when I had the one-stop shop, because it was midwifery at its best. It was taking the underserved, the patients that no one gave a damn about. The residents at the time didn't care for this population, and it was mixed with the unregistered. It was teenagers. It was then AIDS women who had AIDS, patients that the docs didn't want. And so this emergent group of midwives said, we'll take them and we'll give them the same kind of care that Park Avenue gives its patients. And we gave the catalog care to this group and did nothing but shape them into superstars. You know, they did well and they became low risk and they responded to the TLC and the attention and became the ideal patients. And it was a huge patient load, and it was only in the recently that docs woke up and said, we're missing out on revenue and we need this group of patients to line our coffers, that they were taken away from us. Before the 2001, these patients were never patients of doctors. They were always midwife patients. And I think my proudest moment was the fact that I gave so much to this single group of women, the ones that no one wanted, and made, the proverbial, silk out of a sow's ear, the high quality patient. And I started a practice in Columbia at Presbyterian Hospital, where I had up to 38 midwives doing private practice, clinic practice, various midwifery group practices, and all of us working in concert together to provide this Cadillac care to women. And I modeled the whole service on that, in that way, and had outcomes that were unbeatable. Always my career was fraught with success in that way. And at the same time, I had to overcome personal tragedies, is that I'm bipolar, and I had mood swings, and had some bad years, and always worked through them. But so there was personal tragedies mixed in with, triumphs. And I had a family, and they had to be looked after, and with the health issue. But it never seemed to matter in the end. People were kind and considerate, and my needs were met in the long run, and the service needs were met. And one of the things about being a midwife is that you can be forgiving to yourself for failings. And that's not such a horrible thing. Well, you have to, the disappointment is so monumental to not be always up to par, to get things done. And every once in a while you have to say, I have to be taken care of too. And it's not such a bad thing, even though at the time it may seem like like the worst possible thing. But, personal disappointments are bundled in with all the good moments. The human experience has its own rhythm for the rest of us. It has, I thought it was nothing but unkind that I had to take a moment out for myself. But, you realize you have to take a few moments out if you're going to make the distance. Go the distance. Probably the hardest thing to learn, because midwives are so self-giving and so enormous heart that it's hard to take a minute out for anyone but what you're doing for other people. And you have to learn to say, me too. doesn't come easy. I think I've learned that the long way. I think it's been a gift to my forbearance and my general sense of humor and, love of life, that if I hadn't had that, it might have resulted in bitterness and disappointment and recriminations, and I don't have those. I have nothing but, just joy that I was part of something that was so big and so beautiful, and that I had time to have a family, and that I had time to take care of myself. And remarkably, after all the years of hardship, my later years have been remarkably calm. So, what started off as a bumpy road, settled into a easier street. There's nothing I wouldn't do for midwifery or midwives. I've been giving to this profession since 1980, and it seems like no time at all. It really is a gift. And he said it earlier, it's a calling. I believe that it's a calling. The reason you don't get jaded and sick of it is because it's something so much bigger than you inside, dying to come out. And it's self-nurturing and self-sustaining, and it's just ready to be plucked. I see my role, I have an endowment for leadership in my name. It's the foundation, and it's for leadership endeavors and to reward midwives for their leadership roles. And I see that as self-perpetuating into a legacy where I'll have a direct role in nurturing new leaders, leadership strategy, potential. And I can literally tap into the system where I have a role to play in picking and choosing, and after I'm not here, a legacy will go on. And it will always be to help midwives strive to that higher place, to enable more midwives to fulfill that potential to be leaders. I believe leadership has many ways to express itself. So it doesn't have to be a leader at the top of the class. It can be leaders in manners and insight and into just their individual spirit. But it's there in many forms, and it needs to be nurtured, and I'm just grateful to have a part in it. Well, I think what people need to stop being so fearful that midwives are for second-class care, and that when you get a midwife, you're really signing on for a system of care that's foolproof. You have a midwife, you have a system of health care that has physicians and it has complete services, and it has the midwife at the helm, and there's nothing to be frightened of. It's to be, to sign on to midwifery care is to go for the best ride that there is. And it always upsets me when people say it's because you can't afford a doctor, or you can't afford this, and you have a midwife who's not quite as good as a doctor. And when that feeling is erased, I'll feel that midwifery has made its mark. It's truly care for everybody. The only real difference I see is one of attitude, and it's the biggest difference because the MD mode of care is impersonal, and it's we all have the same subset of knowledge, medical knowledge. Birth is birth, and we all have the same use of the medical information that we use, but it's what you bring to the patient that is different, and that is just an attitude. I mean, I used to always say I could have a great birth in an elevator, because it's all about what you bring to the table and bring to the patient. That's why birth is, with doctors, has stayed stagnant, is because they've used the hospital room as the boundaries, and they haven't fully gone over to the patient's side and realized where she's coming from. And midwife has tuned into that. And that's the eternal spirit they're tapped into. And once they have that, they have everything. Doctors don't get it. Some do. I mean, there's some great docs out there. But most of them don't spend the time or the effort to leave their scrubs behind and venture forth to share the spirit. The heart is the boundaryless reach that midwives have vis-a-vis their patients. I mean, that feeling that there's nothing too much to give. The patients can receive everything from you and grow. I think the heart is that ability to share, that growth that you go through together. I think what midwives find so rewarding about a gestation period is that you start with something and it grows and grows and grows and grows. And its fruition is reached, and usually that's the birth and beyond, and the patient and the midwife reach at the same time, and they grow together, and that evolution of commonality is part of that spirit that I see that is so uniquely midwives. That ability to give transcends everything, which was part of what the makeup of the midwife is in the first place. But the giving of herself mixed in with the patient's gift of the midwife reaches the end, and usually that's the birth, and that's why it's so climactic. But it goes on beyond there too. It grows into relationships that transcend birth. But I think that's what the heart of midwifery is, that growth together, allowing the birthing process to evolve in all sorts of different people. It's like everyone has, I mean, Holly Kennedy said it yesterday, everyone's like a little seedling, and you water it and it grows, and it grows into something beautiful. Every patient is a germ of life, and you grow it and you grow it and you grow it, and then you deliver it. It is just birthing new leaders and giving them expression. I mean, giving their voice and expression to be heard. And there's so many ways to do that. And I'm only just learning all the different ways, pathways that can happen. So I'm open to that expression. And I think that's one of the gifts that I have left to give, is that I can allow that to happen and see where it goes. And people will benefit from it, separate from the hands-on care I can give. I can give something that's more lasting. Well, it's easy to be open. You have this in a background. I mean, I'm thankful that I'm not a truck driver or something that's closed in. There is an inner light. Well, that's the calling, the candle behind the eyes, it's there. It just needs to be tapped and other people to see it. That's why it's so sad when other people say, oh, midwife, when they turn their minds off to it and you realize that you've lost ground, that you can't make someone respond to it if they don't have it in them to respond, and that's the difference.